Okay, so I guess I'll kick off this talk titled, let me put on my glasses so I can see. There we go. Titled, Stop Maintaining API and CLI Interaction Libraries. Subtitle, How to Automate Library Creation and Focus on the Big Things. Subtitle, Automating Your Automations Libraries for Increased Automation Efficiency. I wanted to stick another automation in there somewhere, but getting a bit too ridiculous. Okay, so let's start off with what the heck are interaction libraries? So interaction libraries are QE developed modules that allow us to interact with our products interfaces. So for instance, with Satellite, we have Nailgun, which is what we use for our API interaction. That basically gives us something we can plug into our Robotello test suite and say, you know, in Satellite, we have things like activation keys. We can just say activation key.create or whatever, passes some stuff, and it'll actually, you know, communicate with the API, get the results, return everything back, and make it a lot easier for us to actually write tests without having to constantly make API calls manually. Basically, they just provide a layer of abstraction. So you're like, yeah, that's neat, but how do I get one? First, you have to do a lot of research into your interface and learn every API call that's available, all the arguments, everything like that. Then you have to write a library in your favorite language, which of course is Python, including all the calls that you know. And then from there, once you have that initially developed, you have to constantly keep up with every single change and update to your library. So you get a new Z stream or Y stream release, you get a whole bunch of new features because developers love features. So you have to learn all those new calls, any type of new commands or sub-commands if it's on the CLI, and constantly keep your stuff up to date. It does sound like a lot of work, yeah. And it sure is. Maintaining these interaction libraries requires constant vigilance. And if you check out the issues or pull request history for a product like Nailgun, you'll see a lot of it's, you know, adding this in, adding that in, changing this or removing this because it's changed in a particular release. And each of these things are done manually and consumes quite a bit of QE resources. For us, we've been fairly lucky where we have contractors that are a little bit more able to help us keep up with this. But particularly if you have a smaller team or, you know, your team is kind of stretched a bit thin as it is, because of our release cycle and we've got to test everything that goes out. Spending a lot of that time just may not be feasible and you may not have the full coverage for your product that you would like to. And in order to support multiple versions, one way you can get around that is to do branching and tagging in whatever kind of version control system. You should be using Git, is necessary for that. So that's another issue. When you do have the branching and tagging, keeping up with that, making changes specific to that branch, and then deciding if you want to pull something ahead or move it back once you know, maybe added finally the call for that feature that was added, you know, a couple releases ago, duplicating that across the extra branches and tags. So I was going to try to see if you guys are familiar with Raymond Hedinger's talks and just knocking on the desk and seeing if you say, there must be a better way. Yes, there is a better way, which is why I'm here. Good thing you guys attended. I skipped way too far ahead, I think. Yep, there we go. So for that, I came up with APIX and CLIX. I was mostly a 90s kid, so I was a big fan of the whole X thing that came along, and it kind of works with Explorer there, so that's where the names came from. It initially started as a way to kind of grab all the information that's in an API documentation or CLI documentation, because I'm the one that primarily runs our Z stream, so I wanted to see what has changed between releases. And the cool thing about that is once I have all that information, my mic is sliding down. There we go. Once you have all that information, you can do some really cool things with it. So the initial thing that I did was what I call diff with context, which is a bit different than the traditional Unix style diffs where it just shows you, hey, this line's changed from this to that. Well, that's cool. But what if you have thousands of lines in a file and you don't know what was above that line or not? That doesn't really help. So on the screen, you can see what I mean by diff with context. You can see that around line 3,772, under subscriptions, we have some methods that were modified, namely like create. They added some parameters for quantity and subscriptions, specifically quantity underneath that. Deleting the manifest has some extra parameters, listing it, more parameters. And then on the right, we have the CLI side, and we can see some subcommands also changed. Namely, they added some additional options to each of those. This was actually a common theme between satellite 634 and 640, which will be going out the door hopefully within the next couple of weeks, is that they added a bunch of location and organization parameters to our commands. So traditionally, if we wanted to add all those into our interaction libraries, we'd have to hand code them and make those changes to, I'm not sure if I like that. I'll look better in the dark. Add those options into every single one of the entities that we have programmed in. And if you have 40 or 50 or so entities, that's a lot of hand coding to put that in. Of course, you can copy and paste, or depending on your editor, it might make it a bit easier, but there is a better way, which is this. So how do they work? Initially, we'll get to the exploration thing. This mic is terrible. So the way it does it, I like buzzwords as well. It recursively and asynchronously crawls an API doc or CLI help text to get all the information from it. One of the initial challenges I had with CLIX is that most systems or most servers are set to default and have a maximum of about 10 concurrent sessions. So the way that CLIX gets around it is it doesn't ask you, by the way. Maybe that'll be a feature in the future, is it will automatically expand that option in there when you run it, depending on the max concurrent sessions you have. So I recommend about 100, which if you do it synchronously for satellite, it took somewhere around 26 or so minutes. But if you bump up to about 100 max concurrent sessions, then it takes maybe a minute or so tops. APIX, of course, is significantly faster because it is just hitting that API doc, which doesn't have as much overhead, namely setting up the SSH connection. So that typically only takes a few seconds to crawl the entire results. And it stores all the information in YAML format, which in my opinion is one of the most readable formats in there that you can actually still readily pull into a language like Python and parse through. Okay, the way that it does stuff like version diffs is it loads the two stored versions. You have to actually have a stored version from the previous one, as well as run it for the current version, and then it will recursively go through and pull out the diff between the dictionaries and lists that make up that file. That's the way it's able to actually maintain the context and print that out. And recently, because I started developing a new tool to help with diff-based test runs, which might be a talk next year, we'll see, you can also export those results in compact mode. So if you just want to see what's changed and you don't care about all the parameters and everything like that, you can run the compact mode and just say, hey, we've had these subcommands added, and underneath each of those subcommands, I had these particular subcommands added. All right, now the point of this talk is the library generation part of it. The way it does that is it uses that saved data to populate and compile predefined template files. So depending on how much information your API doc or help text gives you, will kind of influence what you're able to actually populate with that interaction library for how you set up our template files. So for our API docs, they actually give us information like, hey, this is what type of information we're expecting, whether that be some type of hash value, just straight string and integer, stuff like that. It'll tell you what's required and what's not. Unfortunately, we're not that lucky with our CLI help text. It basically just says, hey, here are the parameters. It doesn't tell you what it's expecting. It doesn't tell you what's required, which I think is also a pain point for our customers. So hopefully I can use this as a way to be like, hey, let's give some of that kind of hinting in here. So not only can we, create better interaction libraries, but also helps our customers do it. All right. So continuing on with the library generation, the template files allow you to set your desired logic, and they can be as elaborate and as simple as you want. The example I give in APIX actually uses Nailgun. We have a file called entities.py, and it has a lot of information in there. It's set up in a really cool way so it can actually resolve dependencies and everything when you run stuff. So for satellite, if you want to create a like a content view or something like that, and it requires a product and repositories, it will go through and say, hey, you didn't specify that, so let's go ahead and create it anyway with some fake data or whatever, and actually make those entities so we can run this. The version I came up with CLIX is a lot less hand-holdy because we don't have the information for what's required. So it's basically a lot more simple way to just interact with it, and I could potentially show you a demo depending on how much time we have left. The other really cool thing I like about this system is that it's a lot easier to develop features in your library. So one change to a template automatically gets populated to all the entities from there on. I think I have an example of what the template file looks below this, so I can show you kind of what I mean by that. Basically, you can just say you want to add in a new feature to each kind of subcommand or whatever. You can just pop that into the template file for your subcommands, and then when you generate it, which typically takes about a second or less, it automatically propagates through the rest of them. Let's see, and auto generation, which is one thing I also really like about this. You can tell I'm a fan, maybe because I made it. Gives you the ability to generate a new library for any version at any time. This can even be retroactive. Say you didn't start developing an interaction library until 6.3 or so, if that's your product. You can also go back to 6.0 if you want, 6.1, and as long as you can still parse that same information, you can generate an interaction library for it on the fly, and you don't have to worry about figuring out what's changed between then and what's not, and put in all that time. So it eliminates the need for all your branching and tagging in Git with your interaction libraries. So you can forget about having to check out a specific version of, say, Nailgun for Satellite 6.2. You can just generate it on the fly right before you run your tests, and you're good to go. Of course, it also frees up our QE resources, so people will be spending a lot less time actually having to maintain these things, so they can do the stuff that they really care about or really find interesting. I doubt that many people like going through and saying, what's changed between the versions manually, like, hey, this looks like a new subcommand, let me go ahead and add it in. And then go through the pull request process and review and pull in more people that are required to get that actually put in there. And you can also immediately start writing tests for new features. This isn't something that has to be hosted on, some type of Git repo. People can just have this tool once you have it, customized for yourself. Have it stored locally, have like a development environment set up, run it, and they can automatically start using the interaction library personally without having to push it up to Git or anything like that. So it's a lot faster. Okay, so here are what the some of the templates can look like. On the top left there, you have what I'm calling just a subcommand class. This is just basically a subcommand that has subcommands. And then we also have down below that just the method itself, which is basically just a subcommand that doesn't have subcommands. So in here, it looks a lot like Python because that's basically what it is, with just some areas where I put just some identifiers where you can, set up two tildes because that almost never happens in actual code where you have two tildes next to each other. And then just a name for whatever you want to call the feature. And it'll basically just look through that and replace it with the data that you want it to do. So on the left, we have the templates. And on the right is the actual compiled result. So here we have the subcommand class being activation keys. And underneath that, we have the methods that are underneath that, say, add host collection, add subscription. We have all the options that are added in there, as well as the execution part in here that actually, gives the context of what's actually being ran. So you can see kind of how that compiles. Any questions on this part? Yes. You shouldn't need to. If you really wanted to lint and test it, it would actually be best to compile it, since it just takes a second or so, and then lint through that, see if anything comes up in there, and then make adjustments in your templates. And since again it just takes a second, you can make your adjustments, recompile it, and then lint it again. Yeah. One thing that I've considered doing is building in Python Black into the generation. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of that. I'm kind of giving. What's that? That's actually an option you can use for Python Black, but I've given up on that. I just run it manually. Well, not manually. Use it VS Code, so I can just format it whenever I save the file. I've given up on the double quotes. It can do its thing. I don't care anymore. It's opinionated. I'm less opinionated. Have at it. Yeah, that's one of the ways you can get around the linting issue. The only problem with that is you have to get team buy-in because it likes to put things out to about 90 characters, which I think is fantastic because, like most people in Python, the 80 character rule is stupid, and I agree with that. All right, any other questions on the template? Yes. Oh, yeah. Oh, we got that mic again.
Is that good? All right. So you mentioned using the double tilde as kind of a marker in your templates.
Yep.
What prompted you to kind of design that yourself as opposed to using an existing templating library like Jinja or something?
I didn't want to research existing template libraries. Also, I like building things from scratch. So I kind of went that way. But if you wanted to, you could use existing template files. Since the way that it works is you write kind of like a template generator if you want to use this for your own specific product. So if you don't want to use double tildes, you don't have to. You can have it look for whatever you want it to look for. If you like, 1,000 asterisks, you can do that. Doesn't matter. You can use existing template things or whatever you want to research, and it'll just chug through it. Doesn't matter. All right. Oh, cool. We have a little demo of APIX going. I think this should be big enough for you guys to see. Okay, this was about 5 a.m., so I might be a bit slow on typing here. Yeah, it's got help text, of course. So you can see some of the options in there. It makes some assumptions, so you don't have to specify all of the options for some things, because it does have some defaults. So here we're giving it, we're telling it to explore the satellite API docs. Since it did wrap, I wasn't sure if it had an extra space or not, so I just went ahead and deleted that. I gave it, the version number 634, and then debug modes because it looks like it's actually doing something. So it found 671 links, and it's parsing through them now. Again, this is asynchronous, so it goes pretty quickly until we hit maybe about this point, and then we start getting those slower results coming in. And they finally go ahead and finish through. Cool. So it saved its stuff. Now we have those results saved in the local directory to API satellite 64, and you can keep that indefinitely. right now I just have the satellite API in there, and then you can see the versions I have saved specifically. So if you don't specify a version, it'll just give you a date, and you can go by that as well. There's one thing I do want to work on, which is coming up with a way to do versioning for snaps. So since just use Python's default sorting, it doesn't handle 6.4 S23, which it thinks is greater than S9 or less than S9. All right, so just did the diff. Again, that takes very little time. And you can go ahead, if I can copy it. I did it. So we can go ahead and see what that diff looks like. You see added in 6.4 since 6.34. We have all these options in here. And I think if I remember correctly, this file may have been around 16,000 or so lines long. Yeah, so going through and finding that information out, by hand is extremely tedious. And if you're getting snaps every week, it's pretty much not going to happen. Okay, so we can see I'm going to go ahead and make the library for it, which is the makelib command. You just pass the API name and then the version. And I think by default, it'll pull the latest version that it has in the sort, but I wanted 60 specifically. All right, so it's already created the library. Yes.
So it looks like it is finding the templates that you have automatically. Is that based on the API name that you're giving? Or can you, I don't see an option to pass a new set of templates or anything like that.
Yeah, so the way that it works is I wanted to make it as extendable as possible. So if you're going to do this for your product, if you just want to use CLX or APIX, what you do is you'd make a template generator for your project, and then based on the name of it, it'll say, hey, pass this one in to the template generator that you want to use, and then from there it'll use some logic to determine if you didn't pass those results in, which version that you specifically want to use. But since it has a pretty strict file folder structure, it'll know exactly where to look every single time to pull your templates from. And it'll also save it to basically a predefined location every time as well. So if you wanted to plug it into your automation, which I recommend, go ahead and do that as well. All right, so yeah, it generated that, and it took about a second. And then we'll go ahead and look through to see what the entities.py looks like. This one, because it is based on Nailgun, has a lot of boilerplate in there. So the main template file has all this initial information in it. And then eventually we'll get down to the part where it generated it. Okay, so skipping down. All right, so we can see some of the entities it's generated. Let's just pause here. So we have a config group in here. Of course, it populated the text in there. That's kind of the comment text. It gave us the fields in there, namely the config group, the name. Based on that, it determined that the config group should be a dictionary. It is required. The name should be a string. It's also required. The public class IDs should be a list of fields. Those aren't required, and it also populates, of course, the API path from there. And in there, it has the kind of options that are underneath the class as well. Cool, and I think that's the end of that little video. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so how can this fit into an automation pipeline? Yes. Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to try to make this next section a bit short. I think it can fit in pretty well. Basically, what I foresee is, you receive a product snap, you install the product, it can't do it for you. Maybe that's something else it could do. Um, then you would run API Explorer, CLX Explorer, which provide the information that I recommend you save somewhere local to your Jenkins that you can retrieve at any time. You can make the library and pop that immediately into your automated test. Another cool thing, since you can do that context-based diff, is you can run the diff in your automation and then have your automation send an email out to your list. It is a bit spammy, but that's fine. So you can keep your QE members up to date with what's changed between each specific version so they don't have to do the research. They can hey, we finally got that subcommand for my new feature. I can go ahead and test it in this version instead of having to, manually check each release to see if it's there at time. Okay, so can my team use this? Absolutely, you can. I would love if you do, because I like the projects and I'd like other people to like them. API is available on GitHub at that location. You guys can also contact me for that as well. CLX is probably currently in a private GitLab, mainly because there is a talk later on today about patents, and I might be considering that. We'll see. If not, then I'll put it on GitHub as well, and you guys can get that as well. Yeah, so check them out, submit bugs, RFEs, create your own parsers, create your own library templates, and go from there. See. So, any quick questions that you guys have right now? If not, here's my contact information. And if there is no questions, we could potentially do a quick demo. Sweet. Okay. So this should be plenty big. This is my presenting mode. So can you guys see that? Awesome. Okay, so yeah, so this is kind of what the directory structure of CLX looks like. We have in the top there the save CLIs, of course, the specific things in there. It is also going to be available in a Docker format if you want to go from there. Under the libs is where we have the libraries for your templates and the things that are generated. Of course, the stores logs and the whatever. So let's go CLX. List CLIs. Okay, we have Hammer. List versions. Okay, so we've got 634 and 640. This is kind of what I mean by it'll make assumptions. So if I didn't specify the CLI and the version, it should go ahead and assume that I mean basically the default CLI and the latest version in there. Okay, so I made the library. We can go in here, actually pull up an editor in here. This might be a bit more tiny. Where we are. X CLIs. Here's our generated library for 640. So we can go into that and see what it looks like. Is that a bit too tiny? So I'm not sure how to increase it in VS Code. Anyway, so we can see down here we've got some things like our of course our options and our commands and everything like that. Neat. Now let's see how that actually looks. Copy this. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm actually connected to my satellite, but we'll see. So let's go. My AK is equal to activation key. It already knows that it's there, of course. Right now it's setting up the connection. My AK dot create. We'll give it a name of whatever. Actually, I think I've already used that. Walrus. Yeah, sure. Okay, so just here I have kind of some debug text in there just to let us know what it actually wanted to do. Since that didn't seem to work right, we can check out the results. Oh, could not create the organization. Oh, I didn't set the organization ID. Okay, cool. So we can go up here, organization ID is equal to 1. Oh, here we go. This may or may not have been planned. It wasn't looking for an underscore in our organization, but that's okay. We have our template files. So we can go to our subcommand methods. Look at here. We can actually clean that up right now. Save that. Exit out of here. Regenerate our library. Go back in. Activation key. Create with organization underscore ID. There we go. So we made a change. We recompiled it. It populated to all of our subcommands from there, and now it works again. Neat, huh? All right, I'm over about a minute, so enjoy the next talk, which I believe is Elisha. Sorry for taking up your time. Oh. Okay, cool. 15 minutes. Okay. Yeah, you sure can. While he's plugging in his computer, do you guys have any questions from there?
Jake, what is your next evolution of APIX and CLX? Can you give a hint of what you're going to do with it next?
Okay, so yeah, there's actually a few things in here. I'm actually going to be using this to create a diff-based test run. So we have the output from the diff in there. I'm going to use a new tool that I'm calling Plinko, because that's the best game in Price is Right, to identify tests that have that need to be run based on what's actually changed between release versions in the ZStream. On top of that, since it can generate libraries, I'm not sure if you guys were here for last year, but I've been working with a project called Rizzo, which uses machine learning to test software. So one of the hang-ups for that is it actually needed people to make the interaction libraries. Now it doesn't anymore. You can just point it at an instance. It'll generate its own library. It'll automatically explore and start testing and go from there. No people needed. Awesome. Your jobs are still secure, though. Don't worry. Right.